just
Hello, everyone. It is wonderful to join you this afternoon in the Betty Ford classroom. I'm Celeste Watkins Hayes, the Joan and Sanford Weill Dean of Public Policy here at the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy. So at the Ford School, we care deeply about bringing together diverse perspectives and engaging thoughtfully with today's biggest policy challenges. These conversations where we listen, question, and learn from each other are central to who we are and what we value. That's why I'm delighted to welcome our guest speaker, Ted Gaier. Ted is president of the Niskanen Center, a center Time magazine has called the most interesting think tank in American politics. Its mission is to promote policies that advance prosperity, opportunity, and human flourishing, believing that free markets and effective government are mutually dependent. Their work draws on ideas from across the ideological spectrum. That spirit of nonpartisanship and the pursuit of evidence-based solutions is also core to our mission at the Ford School. We believe in learning how to listen and sometimes disagree with respect and openness. You see this in our Conversations Across Differences series, the Resilient Democracies Initiative, our Bridge Builders program, and the campus-wide Year of Democracy, Civic Empowerment, and Global Engagement, which the Ford School helped to lead. Ted brings nearly 30 years of experience in academia, think tanks, and government. He has served as professor at Georgetown University, held senior positions at the Brookings Institution, including executive vice president, and was a visiting fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California and a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. In government, he was Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy at the Department of Treasury and Senior Economist for the President's Council of Economic Advisors. His range of experience is truly impressive. We first discussed, Ted and I, holding this event last spring, and I am so glad we could make it happen today. Brought together by our mutual friend, CC Rouse. As many of you know, this year, the Ford School kicked off our first ever school-wide read, Abundance, by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson. Ted will share his thoughts on the abundance movement, how it connects to Niskanen's broader mission of strengthening American institutions, and how these ideas overlap with other efforts to make government more effective and accelerate technological progress. There's plenty for us to discuss. Just to outline how things will go today, after Ted's opening remarks, he'll be joined by Ford School professor Justin Wolfers for a conversation about the ideas and debates shaping our policy landscape. Professor Wolfers is a professor of economics and public policy here at the University of Michigan, and also a board member of Niskanen. We'll then open it up to questions. To start the audience Q&A, members of our Bridge Builders cohort, Jan Kirchhoff, Adia Bailey and Bria Marie Wiley will ask the first questions. Hello, Bridge Builders. Good to see you. If you're here in person, a microphone will be available. For tuning in online, please submit questions using the link on the event page or in the event description on the streaming page. Thank you all again for being here. And now please join me in welcome Ted Gayer.
I have to say, hearing I have nearly 30 years of experience kind of shook me a little bit, but I guess it adds up. You did your homework. So as Dean Watkins Hayes said, when she invited me to speak, it was in the context of you all reading a community read on the Abundance book by Ezra and Derek. As someone married to an English teacher, I very much endorse the whole idea of community reads. So kudos for that. Ezra and Derek very generously credit Niskanen for a lot of the ideas in the book, as do other people who write on abundance. But before turning to any specific ideas surrounding abundance, I wanted to step back and talk about the larger question of how we can strengthen America's institutions to meet today's challenges. I did some scribbling on the airplane, so I've inserted points. It occurred to me that there's students here, so I want to kind of highlight a few points as I move along in my talk, points that I think will be especially pertinent for people studying public policy. So point one is I contend that the recent growth of illiberalism in our country, which we've witnessed, arises from the failure of our liberal democratic institutions. So one way we think about what we do at Niskanen is we're trying to fight illiberalism by fixing liberalism. When I talk about these institutions, I'm not just talking about Congress or the courts or government agencies. I'm talking about the broader ecosystem of what John Roush sometimes calls the constitution of knowledge. These are the universities, the press, the legal system, even commercial and civic enterprises that sustain an open society. These are the ways we seek truth and attempt to make collective decisions for the public good. When these institutions falter and lose public trust, it creates a vacuum filled by populism and authoritarianism. Decision-making is then guided less by reason and persuasion and more by force, coercion, and power. That undermines not only our freedom, but also, as Celeste mentioned, Niskanen missions. It undermines our prosperity, opportunity, and potential for human flourishing. And we can indeed see this happening today. Many of our institutions have failed to adapt to the modern economic and political landscape, and that failure does create space for an illiberal response. We see it on campus climates that too often reject pluralism and discourage open inquiry. And more consequentially, because it's backed by the power of the state, we see it in the attacks by the administration on free speech, a free press, and the rule of law. The question is what to do about it. At Niskanen, we want to improve liberal democratic institutions through the values of an open society. We do so roughly in three ways. One is we try and diagnose what ails our institutions. Two, this is in tension but not in contradiction. We try and defend those institutions against those who want to tear them down. And three, we try to present an affirmative vision of what well-functioning governance looks like. Sorry. This brings me to my second point, and this is for people in the crowd who might be interested in working in public policy. If you are interested in working in public policy to advance the common good, I think it's important you consider having a strategy for how to do so. We talked about it with the bridge builders before we met earlier today. When you find this could seem like an obvious point, but it's one I think I neglected through much of my career. And I think even if you're in my stage of your career, I think it's worthwhile. When you're considering a job, it's good to think about what is this place trying to accomplish, and how does it go about accomplishing it? Oftentimes, when you think of a job or when we're doing our job, our head is down and we're focused on whatever tasks we have in front of us, and we try and do a good job. I like to think of metaphorically and actually literally lifting our head, trying to figure out as an institution that you're a part of, what is it that what I'm doing here, What is it trying to accomplish and how is it going about accomplishing it? So have a strategy. Just to give you a sense of Niskanen, our strategy rests on 3 parts. The shorthand is we call it theory, policy, and practice. Theory is how we frame and articulate our vision of society, markets, and government. It's our big picture thinking, our essays or analyses that we write for people who shape and drive public policy. I told Nick I'd cut him out of my comments. I'm going to put them right back in. Nick published a paper called The Procedure Fetish for us, which was a real influential article for those who are driving public policy. So that's like a big think piece. How should we think about government? So that's the theory. From theory, we go to policy. That's translating that vision into specific government action. Ideas grounded in research and technocratic expertise. And we embrace our technocratic expertise. So we're trying to take those big think pieces, those views about how you shape society and government, debate them. It's not a dogma. It's largely collectively under kind of liberalism. And from there, we're trying to devise specific policies, get research-based, technocratic focus. How do you actually design these detailed policies? From that's theory to policy. And then at Niskanen, we take another step, which we call practice, which is I love white papers, but we don't just write the white paper. We are trying to take those policies, and we're trying to actually build coalitions to get them enacted and implemented. And there's a back and forth across all of them. I'll just give you an example. We wrote some big think pieces on the importance of social insurance. That led to very wonky, detailed pieces about how to design a child tax credit. That then went into coalition building. In our side, we're working mostly with the right. And anybody who's taken an econ class and thinks about benefits like a child tax credit, you have issues of phase-ins and phase-outs and marriage penalties, and there's all sorts of wonky things. And when you're in the congressional office and you have to try and build a coalition, you're actually changing those pivot points and making those decisions in real time. So they interplay, theory, policy, and practice. That's our strategy. We find that the integration of those 3 is a powerful formula. It's a way of linking ideas to impact. Develop a clear vision, grounded in expertise and evidence, and then do the real world work, the politicking of trying to make it happen. This brings me to my 3rd point, which is that entrenched partisanship, by which I mean a refusal to engage with people who hold different political views, is a good way to undermine a strategy. So Niskanen has a peculiar history. We were founded about a decade ago by people who broke off from the Libertarian Cato Institute. So they broke off because they kind of thought strict libertarianism undervalued the role of an effective government. Over time, that was like 2015. You may have heard there was an election in 2016. And over time, we attracted Republicans who became disillusioned with the direction of the Republican Party under Trump. And then over the years, we started attracting Democrats who were frustrated by what they perceived as their party's complacency over government's inability to get things done. I sometimes internally talk about us as the disaffected. We started with disaffected libertarians, we attracted disaffected Republicans, then we attracted disaffected Democrats. It's kind of a fun place to work because you don't know who's disaffected from where at any given moment. There you have it. I imagine that everybody here, or most people here, especially the students, are motivated, quite understandably, by a desire to translate your strong moral and ideological commitments into policy action. And I am not here to change anyone's politics. I just want to highlight that for Niskanen, our independence from any partisan bloc, our intentionality in engaging people from across the political spectrum has made us much more effective. And I think we're unique, or at the very least among a small group. Why has it made us more effective? Well, it allows us to maintain a culture of intellectual openness. We can draw and synthesize ideas from across the ideological spectrum. Sometimes those ideas are right in front of people's faces. I would say abundance kind of stems from this as well. But because of sort of ideological commitments and blind spots, they sometimes they lie fallow. So that's kind of one of the aspects of it. The part I was talking about this earlier that I think I like the most about Niskanen, I sometimes call it our special sauce. Since we're not tied to a political bloc, our communications is deliberately meant to persuade those who need convincing. right? And so I mentioned the child tax credit. That's just one thing before. We wrote a paper before I was there, but it was a highly influential paper called The Conservative Case for the Child Tax Credit. I think up until that point, there had been a lot of papers written that was essentially the liberal or progressive case for a child tax credit, and nobody had taken the time to actually make the pro-family conservative case for it. And sure enough, I think we were directly responsible then for a child tax credit in the 2017 bill, and we're still plugging away at it. The reconciliation bill that just recently passed, while I'm not a big fan, I did like the fact that they tied the child tax credit, they indexed the benefits to inflation, which is something that we had been advocating. And in our advocacy work, the ideological openness means that we've built credibility and relationships with lawmakers in both parties, which allows us to form the coalitions needed to get policies enacted. So that brings me to the abundance agenda. I'll come back to Niskanen later on in the talk. You've read the book, or you should have read the book, and if not, it's everywhere. But at its core, the abundance agenda is about building and providing more of the goods and services that Americans need. It starts from the simple idea that many of the problems facing the US stem from insufficient supply of things like housing, energy, healthcare, education, childcare. Our work at Niskanen, our work on abundance, before we even called abundance, was cross-ideological. I'm meeting someone, he's not here today. Daniel Takish is a co-author. He's a law student here, but was a co-author of a great paper that Niskanen published about 5 years ago called Cost Disease Socialism. And as described in that paper, the political debate had mostly centered on who should pay for rising costs rather than how to lower those costs. Democrats often responded by expanding or wanting to expand subsidies to make the goods more affordable. But when supply is constrained, those subsidies could just drive prices higher, calling for more subsidies, and off you go with an increasingly large public debt burden. Republicans, on the other hand, at the time of this writing, tended to focus more on cutting the public debt by shifting the cost to the private balance sheet, which doesn't address the costs, inflicts pains on households, and is, quite honestly, politically unsustainable. And both approaches miss the larger issue, which is what abundance tries to get at. When supply is artificially constrained, the result is that government spends more but gets less, households pay more but receive less, and frustration with the government continues to grow. That insight has attracted interest across the political spectrum. So there are some, I think, rays of hope. There is some signs of an emerging cross-partisan coalition around abundance. So you've read the book, but there is policy happening. Just this month, it's baby steps, I know, but Senator Warren, a Democrat from Massachusetts, and Senator Scott, a Republican from South Carolina, working very closely with my team, they co-sponsored a housing reform bill that included many policies focused on increasing housing supply. There's some really niche policies in there that are some of my favorite Niskanen ideas. I can talk about them later. But the idea is to put abundance-type supply-side issues within this housing bill. The bill passed unanimously, bipartisan, in the Senate Banking Committee and passed the Senate, the full Senate last week. So there's a good chance that it's going to become law. So that is encouraging. I think another part of the appeal of abundance is that it offers a compelling, albeit a little simplified, but a compelling story about what went wrong with the economy starting around the time I was born. So not to be blamed, but in the early 70s, so give away my age. This brings up my next point, which is, again, if you're looking for a career in policy, which is that you should consider the balance of what my colleague Jen Polka calls stop energy versus go energy. I think that's a Jen phrase. Am I getting that right? Yeah. Stop energy is essentially hitting the brake, a government that stops things. Now, the brake is very important. You don't want to drive a car without a brake. Go energy is pressing the gas, and the gas is very important if you want to go anywhere. So if you look at the post-World War II era in America, it was one of a lot of go energy, and we saw extraordinary economic growth. You could argue we had a little too much go energy, perhaps. A lot of the projects that remade cities and landscapes often paid too little attention to property rights and environmental damages. By the early 70s, a broad political reaction had set in, one defined by what I believe is an excess of stop energy. Across both parties, Americans concluded that it should be harder to build. We made transportation infrastructure scarce through permitting and proceduralism, so the cost of transportation tripled. We made housing scarce through restrictive building and zoning codes, so prices increased in our most productive cities 7 to 9-fold since 1980. We made it so that people can't move to where they can have the most productive jobs, which made them less productive and also made their colleagues less productive and limited the opportunities for social mobility. And the stop energy didn't just limit productivity and economic growth, it slowed our ability to meet new challenges. We've struggled to transition to clean energy. I'd argue there's public and private financing, and I'd argue that the technology is being developed, but we risk failing to deploy at a reasonable cost and speed due to policy constraints. So again, if you're considering a career in policy, I'd ask that you weigh the right balance of how much of your work is on stop energy and go energy. My next point, and I'm guilty of this, is that abundance too often focuses on things instead of people. Things, what I mean by things, I just talked about housing, I talked about transportation, lots of cool stuff, and that's all important. But the scarcity mindset also affects critical services like education, healthcare, childcare, and elder care. I'm going to talk just about healthcare since we have a great colleague at Niskanen, Lawson Mansell, who works on this, and he's documented a collection of policies that raise costs and limit accessibility to healthcare. Just a few. We cap the number of federally funded medical residency slots, which reduces the supply of physicians. We make it nearly impossible, although we've made some recent progress in Niskanen on this, but nonetheless nearly impossible for qualified doctors trained abroad to practice in the US without repeating residencies. We impose certificate of need laws in many states that require government approval before anyone can open a new clinic or expand a facility. We restrict nurse practitioners and physician assistants from practicing independently. Each of these policies is a choice to constrain supply in ways that make healthcare more expensive and less accessible. And the same story plays out in those other services, whether it's childcare, education, elder care. We have too few providers, too much red tape, too little competition, making it harder and more expensive to provide the services that people rely on. My next point about abundance, which I'm guilty of, I feel like it's a confessional, sorry, is it's not only about removing government obstacles. And there's a lot of that. But it's also about proactive government, a government ensuring that we have an effective, capable government. Again, a lot of the discussion tends to be about the things that government does that's wrong, that's constraining supply. But there's other related aspects. It's in the book. I think I've heard Ezra and Derek remind people it's in the book. In DC circles, we sometimes call it progress studies. That's the proactive things that government can do to accelerate innovation and productivity. So if you've taken economics classes, abundance tends to be how you go from within the production possibility frontier to the frontier. It's kind of a Pareto efficient move. And then progress studies how you shift that frontier, how you expand the possibilities. So these include policies that improve how science is organized, funded, and incentivized, such as through investing directly in R&D, rewarding breakthroughs through innovation prizes, using advanced market commitments to speed the adoption of transformative technologies. It also includes, and to my mind this doesn't get enough attention in the abundance debate, it also includes creating more flexible immigration pathways for scientists, engineers, entrepreneurs, and other talented and hardworking people, so the US can remain the most attractive place in the world to invent, build, and scale new ideas. Again, a focus on people. And I should also, another related concept, sometimes gets lost in the shuffle a little bit, which is the abundance agenda should also embrace what we call state capacity. State capacity is simply the ability of the government to achieve its goals. Again, whether it's increasing supply, like an energy infrastructure, but other goals too, like preventing pandemics, collecting taxes, providing income support. We have a surprisingly poor state ability to deliver on those things. The economist and blogger Tyler Cowen had this great blog piece years ago called State Capacity Libertarianism. I recommend it. He argued that while traditional libertarians worried about excessive regulation, again a big focus of abundance, they often overlooked the opposite problem, a state that's too weak to perform its core functions effectively. So state capacity libertarians, or just state capacity advocates more broadly, accept the need for a competent, well-resourced government because a strong state is essential to sustaining a dynamic economy. The insight is that markets and government are not adversaries, but complements. So yes, abundance is about having the government getting the government to stop doing the things that constrain supply, but it's also about a government that can make things happen. It's about having a more capable state that can deliver broad prosperity. Okay, I'm going to close with one final point, totally out of my comfort space as a pointy-headed academic, one-time academic economist, which is the part that most appeals to me about the abundance agenda. It's going to sound a little quirky perhaps, but I think it has a little bit of heart to it, the softer side of it, which I think gets underappreciated. To me, it offers a healthy political, and I might even say spiritual response to a very troubling political time. A time when the principles of pluralism and liberalism are under threat, even to the point where we're seeing a dangerous increase in political violence. So, and I'm also a person who's run organizations, so this weighs on me, because one can understandably respond to these times with despair or outrage. But despair and outrage are neither good for your soul, nor are they a compelling strategy, nor do I think are they politically persuasive. So the abundance agenda, and I would argue a broader commitment to the principles of liberalism, principles of agency, of constructive engagement, of learning, and of hope and progress, they offer a way to channel our energy into repairing our institutions so they can improve Americans' lives. Abundance does provide an agenda that can sustain and model the habits of pluralism, good governance, and liberal democracy at a time when these habits are under threat. It reminds us that the answer to our challenges isn't to abandon our institutions, but to renew them, to make them work for the common good. Thanks. Where do you want me? Let's talk.
Actually, my favorite thing, Ted, is I have known you for a long time. I've not actually had a chance to look you in the eye and tell you how much I admire you.
Oh, that's sweet.
Very few people can speak from the heart through a pointy head. And what you've achieved is really extraordinary. What you've achieved as an institution builder, but also as a policy wonk. And I know lots of purists in the world who would define themselves by what they're not, and they would have done less for the world than you have. So hats off to you, sir.
Thank you.
I'm just going to start with the simplest question. You were talking about abundance. I'm an economist.
Yeah.
I don't get it. It just seems simple. You said abundance is building and providing more of the goods and services that Americans need. Crikey.
Yeah.
Who's against that?
Yep.
Isn't that in my intro course? So what's complicated here?
I'm going to call on Nick Bagley for all the complications. So I don't think I told you this, Joe. So first of all, I want to say thank you for the opening comments to me. Before I answer Justin's questions, I would just say, and I was talking to some of the students earlier today, that the parts of my job that I love the most is that I've often been surrounded by extremely talented people, and my job is to just give them the opportunity and the space to do what they do best within an institution where we have an understanding of what we're trying to accomplish and how we're trying to accomplish it. And I have these moments throughout my career. It's my favorite moments where there's an issue and I'm surrounded by a great colleague and the issue comes up, and I have this is a leadership confession. I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what I'm doing. And then I kind of have those resources around me, those talented people around me, and then they just do what they do. And so I miss my times with Justin when he was at Brookings. I always learn from him. I appreciate your comments. And it's just, it does remind me of the times just to spend time to you and see you do what you do so well. It was really a pleasure for me. What's so complicated? I don't know. I have a paper that I've drafted, but I can't quite publish because I'm like, in fact, I submitted it, and it had a little bit of the reaction that you just gave me, like, but of course. My paper was like, abundance is Econ 101. That there's really, from an economist's point of view, there's not much there. Which is why my speech had almost no economics in it, had a little bit of law, had a little bit of like cultural stuff, a little bit of psychology and kick in the pants, because I do think that there is sort of, a societal cultural malaise or disposition towards stop energy. And I see it in our education system. I raised 3 kids, I see it, which is like, there's almost like a party game where you say, hey, here's a great idea, and the intellectual thing to do is to tell you what's wrong with it and why you shouldn't do it. So the economics is actually fairly easy. If you want to start getting into all the different procedural constraints, and this is why I pointed to Nick on it, unless you have, which I'm sure lawyers do, this perverse fascination with the law, it's just amazing how deep and complicated and entrenched and how difficult it is to change it. So, it's not a good economist answer, but it's like, it's culture, it's norms, it's, all tied up in our legal apparatus. But the graph is actually easy on the economic sense. It seems highly uncontroversial to me from just a demand-supply point of view.
So then it sounds like it's a political theory.
Yeah, I think it's a political and cultural theory.
Okay. And so then the thing that's compelling about it as a political theory is you're sort of operating between these poles. Too many of us are on Team Blue, and there's a bunch of stuff we can't pick up. Team Blue can never say a union did a bad thing.
Yes.
Too many folks are on Team Red. There's a similar set of things. They've never seen a business regulation that they thought helped markets function better.
Yeah.
And so there's this big fallow area in between. So that seems obvious. Let's go to not the center, but where the work's not being done. But that means you need to go and look for coalition partners. Mm-hmm. That can be complicated. So I remember, I'm not going to speak out of school, but I remember on the advisory board, one of the discussions we had is, I'm not going to say who X is, but should we work with Senator X, who is an insurrectionist? Might have just given some of it away.
Yeah.
Yep. But actually, it's a short list. I didn't tell you who. How do you navigate that?
Oh boy, that's a great question. I almost navigate that in real time every day.
Yeah.
I'm going to guess we did work with Senator X.
Yep.
Not on insurrection. Not on anything remotely around that topic. But we worked with him or her, I should say. And that is our disposition. So a couple things. I kind of tucked in there in the beginning of my speech. This is what I call a healthy tension at Niskanen. The 3 things that we try and do, broadly speaking, is diagnose and critique the state of our institutions, which means taking a hard look and not giving brief to people who are like, no, everything's okay. Or don't say anything bad because that'll give you ammunition to the other side. So we diagnose and critique those institutions. We stand up and defend them against those who want to tear them down because we think the alternative to liberal democratic institutions are bad things. And we try to have an affirmative vision of what healthy institutions look like. 1 and 2 is in daily tension within Niskanen. I call it a healthy tension. It makes for an interesting place. Niskanen, I will give a little bit of our history. We were also, I would say, if not the center, very closely of the center of the never Trump Republican movement in 2016 after the election. It didn't work. He won again. And it's not to say that we still don't do 2, but what I say every day at Niskanen is we should critique those institutions. We should defend those institutions, but we need to have a strategy, and it's not about emoting. It's not about showing what side you're on. It's about saying, like, what is a value-added thing consistent with our strategy, our theory, policy, and practice that can actually lend to this debate, and it builds our credibility. And the way, and I'll just kind of go all over the place, and this is the way it gets complicated, is I think and our culture, very consistent with the principles of liberal democracy, is engagement. It's learning. It's constructive engagement. It's trying to approach people. It's openness. It's the open society. So we are disposed to talk to people. Where we lose credibility, and let me just give a couple of examples. We had a recent case. I won't name the governor, but we were very successful in getting something through the state legislature, a policy that one of our teams worked on. And it went for the signature of the governor, and his chief of staff Googled us, and it turns out we wrote a piece critical of him years ago. You can figure out who this is. And he vetoed it. All right, we put a lot of work into it, whatever, he vetoed it. So my response to that, the team's response to that is like, what are you going to do? Right? Was the piece a good piece? And so the big thing I have, and some of the things where I thought some other institutions in the think tank world fell short, is by all means be critical when the administration does things, but be critical in a value-added way. Don't emote. Don't just add another op-ed that everybody's read. Don't make a rush piece that is not based on quality. It's not about you just having your voice for the institution. It's going to be another outrageous thing next week. This is not helping. And that's how we lose. If we publish those pieces, then when we go to a politician's office and they're like, you wrote this crappy piece that was critical, you're a partisan, then he's right. And so we try and avoid that.
Ted, I'm going to turn a little more personal.
Yep.
Not once have I turned up to an Ann Arbor dinner party and said, I work with a think tank that hangs out with insurrectionists.
Yeah.
I've not once admitted it in front of my students.
Yeah.
Give me some advice or some courage.
That is a really good question. Well, hang out is not how I would characterize it. I think if you value what I think universities were built to value, which is what we call an open society, which is a leaning in towards engagement, towards learning, this country needs more space for those kind of conversations. And if you want to start ruling out people that you think are repellent, and I think an insurrection is a repellent point of view, it's a slippery slope. So we just, and we've seen it, this to me is a product of the liberalism of the left, which is, it's quite reasonable to say I won't speak to person X because this is a repugnant view. The definition of repugnance then, to me, gets watered down. And next thing you know, you're not talking to all sorts of people that you can learn from. And so, we would rather, it's sort of type 1, type 2 errors, like we'd rather make the mistake of speaking to somebody like that if we can advance the public good, like we just did on a housing bill. People's lives will be better for it, and it's worth it for us. Come hang out with us too.
Yeah, I know. Well, so sticking with the personal stuff, when I first met you, you were running the economics group at Brookings. Brookings is extremely nonpartisan, which is why so many Democrats work there. And so we would sit around the lunch table,
yeah,
and it would be you and me and 9 other Democrats, and you were a former Bush appointee. I've always wondered just what it felt like to sit in your shoes in a predominantly liberal institution, bringing maybe similar values, maybe different, different perspectives. Maybe we're a little too glib around the table.
Yep, that's a good question. First, the thing that triggered me when I first got to Brookings, I'm sharing some.
I should say, this is not meant to be gossip about Ted's
No.
My life. I hope folks see analogies to their own, the tables you sit around as well.
I appreciate it. When I first got to Brookings, I remember the communications, somebody got quoted in the newspaper and they said the left-leaning Brookings institution, and the communications person at the time would, every time that happened, they'd call the reporter and ask for a retraction of that phrase. And then they'd go online and they'd say what you just said, which is like, Well, it says here 98% of your people either worked for or donated to Democrats, and then there was me. And then they would like gin up. There was like some people who worked in non-political jobs in Republican. It was just ridiculous. To answer your question, it depends when you ask what table and when you ask me.
Mm-hmm.
I got to Brookings in 2009 and I left in 2022. And in the early days, as the person who was more conservative than the average person around the table, I loved it. I loved it because these were super smart people who I could learn from, who could challenge me. And this is the whole reason for viewpoint diversity is an absence of viewpoint diversity, I think, makes everyone dumber. And so to me, being challenged by people who I thought were wickedly smart was great. And it was always in that spirit. I will say over time, it wasn't, it got worse. I had even written things at Brookings early on in my career that I think I would have gotten, by the time I left in 2022, it would have been harder to write.
Is this a statement about the institution or about the political environment?
Both. I think
Okay.
the political environment affected the institution, and I was busy doing other things then, so I wasn't writing as much, but I remember thinking, you know, there's a few things. I once wrote a piece questioning the EPA's use of global benefits for carbon when measuring the price of carbon emissions. And I kind of made the point, like, for domestic policy, we always consider domestic benefits, because that's who's. It then somehow became an America First paper, and I got some heat for it. That's fine. But I think it became much more constraining. And I think part of my commitment to institutions and to, as an economist who uses the phrase liberal democracy much more than I ever thought I would have ever used it, I think that was the personal for me. And at the same time, I'm raising 3 sons who are going to very good private schools. My wife is a teacher at a private school. And I felt that over time, the values of the place started becoming more constraining, less open, more restrictive. My kids would come home and tell me what they were talking about. And I'd say, yeah, but you know, there's this view. He's like, yeah, but you can't say that. I mean, really harmless stuff. And I was like, wait, you can't say that? Like, that doesn't make sense to me. And I felt that was happening a little bit at Brookings in a way. So not among that same group of people at the lunch table that you're describing, but I think it got a little frustrating, a little uncomfortable. And I was in a leadership position, so it's not like I was working on my job, but it's like, who needs it in all sorts of ways.
I'm just going to hit you with one more question, and then I'll go to the students. One of the advice I've given our students is always to have mates on both sides of the aisle. By mates, I mean, that's Australian for friends. People who you admire, who you understand they have a good heart and integrity. And from that, you can work your way to understanding that different folks can have different views. And, you know, you've been in that crew for me. Michael Strain's been in that crew. I always had a group. Greg Mankiw's been in that group. On and on it goes. I had a whole slew. I had my little collection of pet Republicans. And hopefully I was in your group of Dems. And I've discovered 100% of them are never Trump. Which means I'm failing the rule I set for my students, which is I have no close friends whose integrity I admire are in one of the major 2 parties of American politics. Where are you on that? What advice would you offer those of us in the room?
Well, my experience is a little different because I have a large and complicated family. I'm the son of immigrants, and so we have, everybody in my family is the child of immigrants. We weren't here very recently, and so I don't know why that speaks to the complication of my family politics, but I have some dear loved ones who love President Trump, and these are people I love deeply. And in some sense, that's always helped me. I've always had political diversity in my family. Like, it just starts out like, this will reveal my politics a little bit, so forgive me. You know, the kind of crazy uncle who has views about who's going to be the next president, but of course everyone knows he's totally out of his mind and that'll never happen. He kind of had a point. You got to listen to them a little bit more. And I also have to say, and this gets into, I mean, I feel like I'm living this when I talked about the two aspects of like Niskanen trying to both be a critic of the state of our institutions, calling for bold reform of them, and also defending them. A lot of Trump, I think with Trump and the administration, I would take academia as an example. I've been highly critical of academia over the last 5 years or so, 6 years. And I would say that again, even in my kids' schools too. It's been a source of discontent. And I'm married to a lifelong teacher. And yet I think that what the administration is doing with their threats to higher education is really appalling and is, I don't want to say existential, but could be gravely harmful. I think both views are true. And it's sort of hard to kind of, state both of them because, I don't know, it just gets complicated. So personally, I don't have that issue because I'm surrounded by or I have family members who are very pro-Trump. And professionally, we work with Republicans. And some Republicans, I would say it's a horrible thing when Charlie Kirk was assassinated. But I gave a talk at Niskanen afterwards, and I highlighted Governor Cox and Bernie Sanders, who both gave what I thought were beautiful statements after that. And they were both what I would say statements of liberalism, of political engagement, of not resorting to violence, of sort of the American idealism. And so in that sense, there are public figures I can look for or look towards. But I will confess that I have one close friend who is a Trump supporter, so I don't have a lot. And I think part of that is just being in DC, working in the George W. Bush administration. Those tend to be the Republicans I know. And so it's a complicated world.
Now, the students had questions. Was that what the run-up show was? Yep.
Okay, I'll leave it there. But thank you both for being here. Thank you for all of your insight. You've been very inspiring today. So I had a question. As the former vice president of Brookings and current president of Niskanen Center,
Yep.
How do you engage actively in constructive dialogue while in disagreement with someone of opposing views on policy, especially in your role at a think tank?
So I think there's both sort of the dialogue internal. I'm going to focus on internally. I think a lot of my dialogue on these issues is internally. So a couple of points. One, and this was my advice I think I started at the meeting, like when you're looking for a job, one of my points was it's good to know what the institution, wherever you want to work, what are they trying to accomplish, how do they go about accomplishing it, kind of related to that, what are the principles that undergird their work. So those three things I think are key. I repeat that a lot in Niskanen. And I don't just lecture it, it's what I call shared knowledge. When I first got there, the first 6 months was like, let's have an articulation. I have a little one-pager, my little cheat sheet. Then I kind of tweak along the way as I have conversations internally. Here's what we're trying to accomplish. Here's how we go about doing it. Here are our principles. I have my fourth criteria of a healthy institution is once you figure out the first three. The fourth one is your financial model needs to be in service of and not distorting of those top three, which also when you're looking for a job, you kind of want to know. They may have a beautiful website that says, here's what we're doing, here's how we do it, and then their financial model doesn't support it. So part of it is just the repetition. We are both critiquing institutions and we're defending institutions. This is what that is. This is what that is. When we do that, we have a strategy. Here's how we go about doing it. And so we have those kind of conversations. And then there's another aspect of it. This gets into our principles a little bit. It's sort of like I've tried to navigate when I was at Brookings this way too, through very tumultuous times, especially to be in Washington, D.C., is I think of an organization like Brookings or like Niskanen, and I say this internally a lot, as an institution and a community. And to me, that's a way to give space to people who might be feeling very different about the political climate, who might be feeling upset I said before, despair is not a good strategy. It's not politically compelling. But people sometimes come to work feeling despair. And as a community member, I want them to feel like they have a community of support. And also we're an institution. So they also have a job to do. So how do we have, if you believe in what we're trying to do, then whatever you bring to work as a community member, how do you channel that into what I hope when you took the job, you read, this is what we're trying to do, this is how we do it, these are our principles, and you channel it in a constructive way. And so to me, that's a way to like give space to people who might disagree, who might feel, disagreement's great. Like nobody has a problem. It's when it's emotional, which it understandably is, that's when it gets complicated. I've been married for 25 years. The one lesson I keep learning over and over again is you never tell somebody their feelings are wrong. Right? Like, oh, you shouldn't feel despair. It's not that bad. It's like not, I keep learning that lesson in life. But like, that's why I have like the community and the institution thing. Like we can embrace, you should feel like you should have those different views, those different positions, but also we also have a collective mission here that we need to dedicate to. So I try and create that environment. Sometimes it works better than others.
Hello, thank you so much again for being here. So you mentioned earlier that entrenched partisanship is a good way to undermine a strategy. And in the spirit of truly strengthening American institutions, how should students, whether it be future policymakers, activists, leaders, go about including all American perspectives and those on both sides of the political aisle to become better able to work together in designing effective policy strategy, especially as algorithms on social media encourage particularly younger generations to only accept one side as quote unquote correct? Yeah,
it's a great question. I'm going to do what Justin did. I'm going to kind of personalize it. This is how I think about it in the world I live in. Well, I'm an outlier. I'm not on social media. So I'm not recommending that, although I think it helps my life. But the way I personalize it is, I think the public debate tends to make us dumber. I just think it does. I think any hot topic issue that we want to talk about, whether or not it's like DEI or whatever you want, cultural norms, I think a lot of the public debate is a race to reinforce priors and like put you to extremes. It's just not a conversation. And this is just kind of personal advice. Like some of the best parts of my life, so I was referring to Justin before. Like when I think of Justin, I don't know, I can cite some of his papers, but I actually think about sitting at the lunch table, hearing about his kids, hearing about his work, and learning about him, and he's got a story to tell. And to the extent we had political differences, that comes out in his story. But it's a story. I have a story. I told you about my parents, they're the immigrants. Like, I have a whole story. You have a whole story. And so I don't know if that's really good advice, but I think like getting off the internet might be helpful every once in a while. The way to really engage people with different views is to kind of just at a sheer level of humanity, they have a story to tell about whatever topic you're interested in. It's a little bit about their kids and their family and their background and where they came from and all the rest, but it's also about whatever that issue is. And I think if you actually, it's a real skill. I don't know that I have developed it, and I'm sure there's classes here on it too, but a real skill and an art to like, how do you approach people that way? And so, I don't know, it's hard to scale. Like what I just said is really good in small group conversation and really hard in large, even in this size. But that's my advice, is to try to, whatever the noise is over there, there is a story underneath there and there's a humanity underneath there that is a way to kind of, and this is what I was talking about even with my relatives who I disagree with politically, like I love them. And I know their stories, and so I can learn a little bit about their perspective politically, even though I kind of also very much disagree. Sure.
Ted, I'm going to push you on that. So
Please.
I love this notion of stories. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
I'm going to take it away with me. But it's also the case that the head of a major think tank just came to a policy school and said, the policy debate makes you dumber, ignore it.
Did I say that?
I'm quite sure. I'm pretty sure you even pay a lot of people to write things in that policy debate.
Yep. No, well, can I amend what I said?
Yeah.
I don't think the policy debate makes you dumber. I think on most of the salient, hot topic, adversarial, confrontational, partisan issues that take a lot of the airspace, the debate makes us dumber. A lot of policy debates is actually quite thoughtful, right? One of the ideas that one of our little strategies we talk about at Niskanen, which is a Matt Iglesias term, is the secret Congress, which is like, when he wrote it, it was like, oh, there's this whole big debate here about bathrooms, right? But in the meantime, we can actually engage on a child tax credit. Like, nobody's talking about it, and that's fine. And you can get wonky, and you can find your wonky counterparts on the other side of the aisle, and you can engage them. But getting to know their humanity is like kind of hearing a little bit about their story, getting to know them personally, getting to understand their language so that you can actually talk to them where they're from, right? Like, you know, on the child tax credit again, like the pro-family discussion there, it was much more compelling than framing it in a different kind of policy lens. So I don't know. I don't know if I've successfully persuaded you. I don't want to be too glib and just say the policy debate is dumb. I think there's a lot of really smart, wonky, interesting policy conversations. I was just talking more about the stuff that like takes up all the oxygen. And I would say on a lot of the stuff, this is like a kind of, you know, guy who's had a leadership role at Brookings and at Niskanen. It's sort of kind of my style on a lot of this stuff. I mentioned DEI earlier, which is like, there's a lot of kind of very sharp, loud views on it. But like when you're running an institution, you can talk about these kind. You don't use the labels that are supercharged, but you can actually talk about like what we're trying to accomplish as a workforce, what kind of community we're trying to build. Like there's some real values there that people have in common that you can get past the noise and talk about like, oh, we kind of do learn from different perspectives. What does that mean? How do we create the conditions for this, right? And it's not like, I don't know, I'm not on social media, so it's not, so I can't characterize it, but it's not that charged. You can kind of personalize it in a way, and I think you can make progress. I think just one last point on that one, and maybe this is a little bit of a difference between your life and my life, is like, I think I spent a lot of time managing organizations. So when you ask me about how to have these kind of conversations, my mind goes to like when I was like in a leadership position at Brookings or at Niskanen, like I probably spent too much time on that. I mean, not it's too much time, but like Justin's more out in the public realm, and I admire him for it because he's so effective at it and great at it. And so that's like a different kind of engagement. I don't know I'm as comfortable with that, maybe, like facing those kind of differences in the public sphere. I think it's different.
I think your rules actually go exactly the same.
Really?
Like if you want to make a point about a child tax credit, you don't have to preface it with whether you're for or against abortion.
Yeah.
You can just say that you love children.
Yeah.
And you can tell stories of children.
Yeah, that's right.
So we have one more question, and then we're going to go to the audience. So
Sure.
Audience, be thinking of your questions. So this comes from a student. If you could design a new institution or system around the role of government in supporting science and innovation for the public good, how would you go about it? And how would you measure its success or failure?
Can you repeat it? A new institution for what?
Yes, if you could design a new institution or system around the role of government in supporting science and innovation for the public good, how would you go about it? And how would you measure its success or failure?
I don't know the answer to that. I would say a few things, just because there's much in my wheelhouse. One, so when I left, I went from Brookings, I think the oldest think tank, one of the largest think tanks. I also, somewhere in my bio, I was at American Enterprise Institute. I saw Robert Dorr was here, right? So like, I think I'm one of the only people, by the way, that was both at Brookings and AI. It's a little point of pride, like center left, center right kind of thing. But when I left that world for Niskanen, I sort of entered a world of a lot of smaller, younger, scrappier institutions. It was deliberate. I mean, I sacrificed something. I lost something by doing it, but I gained a lot, and there's a certain energy around it. All of which is to say, one of our closest allied think tanks is a place called the Institute for Progress. And they do what that question asks. Their whole focus, I mentioned progress studies on it, their whole focus is on things like meta-science and R&D, and how do you actually get more innovation, and how do you spur government investment, and all the rest. So they're, I think, very, very good on the theory, policy, and practice model that we have. They're tiny and they're newer than us. They used to They were used to be Niskanen interns, proud to say, the people who founded it. So they're quite good. I would also just say I'm also involved in this other project. I should say, this is maybe for Justin's consumption, as the former editor of my favorite journal in economics, the Brookings Papers. One of the things I'm trying to do at Niskanen is kind of bridge the gap between academics and policy. I think academia neither informs nor is informed by policy enough. I think both of those, and so I've got some projects I'm working on as well. But one of the things I'm working on is this grant proposal where we're standing up a new journal to measure the returns of R&D. So it's a little bit of just getting better evidence about what are the returns and how does it differ public versus private, and global versus domestic, and all the rest. So I don't know that I have a good answer. I like the Niskanen model, and I think Institute for Progress would be a good place to start for that person. Yeah, they're great.
Anyone in the audience have any questions? Yes, thank you so much for coming today. I really appreciated your comments on partisanship. It's a lot of what I've been learning here at the Ford School. I'm in my first semester here. But my question actually goes back to your opening comments. And you might not have an answer, but when you were talking about theory, policy, and practice, Abundance talks a lot about deregulating housing and infrastructure, and then gives examples of emergency orders, like with COVID vaccinations and rebuilding the Pennsylvania Bridge, I think was one of the examples. Yep. You talked about stop energy. And so obviously you can't just call an emergency order whenever we need something done, but there are examples of where the government can use that go energy. So I was wondering if you think that there's a way within our current political institution to channel that go energy from these emergency orders into our everyday practice, or if we have to, reform our institution.
Yeah, it's interesting. The case you're talking about was the bridge in Pennsylvania when Governor Shapiro rebuilt it, and somebody will remember 14 days because he just subverted all the permitting and zoning and contracting, and I don't think he subverted the union requirement. I think he stuck to that one, which is actually interesting. So I don't know the answer to your question. I was not a fan of Doge because I thought it was too destructive and not well thought through and lacked sort of expertise and discernment. But it did open up the possibility for me that a lot more can get done than one thinks, right? And I mean, Trump is a master at that. Some of it, I think, I would not replicate because it's questionably legal. I think a good litmus test is a good political litmus test. I'm the only person I think I'm the only person I know who's not upset about the East Wing. I don't know if you're following the story about the East Wing. Maybe that's a charged statement. Because I was like, Jesus, it's ridiculous that you can't renovate the White House.
And have house.
What?
The People's House.
And you can't have a big ballroom. I didn't like that. It's not my style. But then you could change that. So I don't know. I don't know the answer to your question. It does seem like the realm of the possible is bigger than one thinks, right? And Jen Polka, a colleague of mine at Niskanen, that was some of her reflections early on. Some of the things she wanted about time to hire and things like these things that were limiting the ability to revamp the civil service, you could just do, legally do. And just the amount of, this kind of gets back to before the go energy, and this gets a little bit back at my kids' education too, which is I find it's a weird world. I find a lot of, my kids went to very progressive schools. I find a lot of progressivism is really conservative, right? That's the stop energy. It's well, you can't do that, right? And so, I don't know. I think we can do more than we can, and I think the early months of Doge actually, some of the stuff wasn't terrible, and they just showed that the realm of possible is greater. I'm not giving you specifics because I don't know. I don't think we should subvert the law, but I do think there's more possibility than I think. I think the thing that has stopped us before is sometimes less about legality or rules and more about we have to make sure that nobody's going to be upset by this. And that's just as a recipe for inaction.
Hey, thanks for your talk. So speaking as somebody who's very sympathetic to the kind of abundance worldview, there's been a lot of debate, as I'm sure you know, about after abundance came out, about like, is this kind of the best direction to like motivate the way that politicians are talking about what we're doing? That, you know, while you might agree with a lot of the kind of precepts of what your center stands behind and what the abundance movement is about, we might also kind of think that when it comes to politicians talking about this in particular, that like people are going to say, no, you know, I don't really want, you know, the state to have like greater control. I like having the control to slow things down when new things are getting built in my community or whatever. So I'd just be interested in hearing your perspective on whether you think the movement should, I guess, try to capture like more of what politicians on both sides are talking about, or whether this should kind of operate a little bit more in the secret Congress space and try to do these kind of back channel things that it seems like your center's been effective doing.
Yeah, it's interesting. A few things. I told you about some of the things I like most about my job. One of the things I like least about my job throughout my career is every time I'm like in Niskanen where we have a good idea and then I label it, and then tomorrow it's, quote, partisan coded. And I was like, whoa, I didn't, like, yesterday it was, so abundance to me, the first time I heard abundance, I think in a policy context, was Brink Lindsay, he's a colleague of mine. I think he was at Cato when he first started using it. And now, so then there's this like, how's it coded? And then when I started putting it on the Niskanen website, I had some Republicans in my staff who were like, no, that's coded left. I was like, I thought it was coded right. Like, and this gets into our communication strategy. So one other observation about abundance. If you want to find a nonprofit with the word abundance in it, go to California. If you want to find abundant policies, go to Texas. Nobody's calling it abundance, right? But it's a much more abundant-friendly policy landscape than California. Maybe that's why you need abundant nonprofits there. So we are sort of skating this from a Niskanen point of view. Like, I kind of like that a bunch of journalists are saying we're the closest thing to a think tank on abundance. And when we meet with mostly moderate Democrats, but Democrats, they sometimes will give us entry because they see us associated with abundance. And oftentimes we meet with Republicans and we don't mention the word abundance whatsoever, and we talk about permitting reform. And it's great. And we speak their language about why permitting reform is great. So that's how we skate it. I will say that I've had like multiple meetings and dinners with politicians where we talk about abundance, and they say, I never use the word abundance, Democrats. And they're like, I don't use the word abundance. That's it. And then they do what politicians do, and they give me a really compelling, like, it's about people and about, but I don't know, I can't do it. I'm not a politician. I'm like, oh yeah, that sounds good. So I don't know. I don't know what the political strategy of it is. And we operate selectively, in some sense, in your secret Congress. Like sometimes we're pushing stuff. We don't say abundance because we think secret Congress, why make this out to be an Ezra Klein thing? And sometimes we get purchased with it. And so we really are, it doesn't always work. Again, I'm talking internally and managing Niskanen. Like it doesn't always work to do that, but that's what we're trying to maneuver. And I also have to be in a position where 2 years from now, we might be in this room and someone would say, remember when abundance was a thing? And I don't think we'll be saying that because we got rid of all these supply constraints, right? The policy portfolio will still be prevalent, hopefully less necessary, but will still be prevalent. But we might not be like, oh yeah, nobody got elected on that word, let's call it something else, or something. It's Econ 101, it's fine with me. So I'm not sure politically what the right approach is. We're trying to come with ideas and sort of find willing voices.
Thank you so much for being here and chatting with us. Given all the power that's being flexed by the economic elite and their kind of adoption of some of this innovation, R&D, like techno-futurist future, how can we ensure that the abundance agenda isn't co-opted by people who don't really have the public good, the common good in mind? Is it the role of institutions to do that? And is that kind of in the stop mentality that you were critiquing?
So I'm not sure how to answer. I think there's a critique of abundance that I think is reconcilable, right? So and abundance is the term of the day, but we've written on this before. A lot of the stop energy that's out there that creates sort of obstacles for producing goods and services also, I think, leads to what we call capture, right? Of like narrow interests being able to capture rents and advantages for their own gains. And I think that's entirely consistent with abundance, meaning if you think that the problem is sort of, you know, corporate power exerting influence of government, quite honestly, we've seen that a lot, or government exerting influence on the private sector, we see even more right now. I think the abundance frame is one lens to see it in a reconcilable way, which is like, the more you kind of create these kind of artificial constraints, the more you have this sort of grab for power, and people with greater influence can exert it more. As far as like technological, I don't understand. I don't quite know on that one. I'm not quite sure what you mean as far as like technological innovation. There's a whole AI story out there. I don't see it directly related to the abundance agenda. They kind of swim in similar circles, but I'm not sure how to answer that.
I just want to add something. The stem of your question really woke me up. You said, and I've heard similar words in rooms like this many times before, given the power being flexed by the economic elite. The MAGA movement's not economic elite. It's working class Americans. And it creates a tension deep in my bones that I've always thought of myself and identified as someone who wanted to help the downtrodden. But I identify as a Democrat, and the Democrats today are the party of elites, certainly educated elites. And I'm no longer a member of the party statistically that draws in the working class. There's a real reckoning for many of us as we try to think through that. Am I right and they're wrong? Or are they wrong? Or are they right? And I've suddenly found myself on the wrong side of history. I think the scripts that we use to talk about this are really different in the current moment, in a way that I've never seen before in my life.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Luca. Thank you to both of you for being here. You guys have done a really, really awesome job. My question is kind of what everyone's been talking about, right? Which is thinking about abundance. And I'm, a senior in college, and I'm trying to think through like kind of what you guys have been talking about, that it's not just about growth, but it's fixing the institutions within. That's kind of what I also read about on the website at Niskanen. And I'm thinking like, when we're trying to think about these institutions that provide transit services, power, energy, infrastructure, right? A bridge, for example. Like, what do you think the major issues are from us getting to like the place where the U.S. should be or needs to be, right? And how do we fix that? Are we trying to fix it through more capital, fixing regulation, fixing the politics? And that's kind of my first part of my question. And my second part, which is kind of going back to I'm a senior in college, is like, where do you think resources are going to be put into? Is it going to be put into like more huge data centers and chips? And then like, where do you think it should go as well? You guys can both answer. Really curious.
Want me to start?
I want you to take it all.
It's funny. I mentioned the phrase before, state capacity libertarianism. It's a little bit of my kind of ideological or political journey as a guy who is sort of more enamored by markets, still enamored by markets, but more of a small government person. And I think my political journey is seeing that an ineffective government actually hampers the things I care about, both that I thought that the market can deliver. It leads to government capture, it leads to capture, it leads to inefficient markets, it leads to lack of competition, it leads to political blowback, which is part of the working class answer as well. So I'm sort of like a libertarian leaning guy who thinks that the answer is a really, really good government. And we have something we stood, when I got to Niskanen, one of the things we stood up is something called the State Capacity Initiative. And it's like, it's got simple goals, like how do we get a really good civil service, which yes, means hiring the right people and also means firing the wrong people, right? How do we make sure that they're more outcomes oriented and not process oriented? This gets into the question about the bridge, that they're just not encumbered with all sorts of process rules. We had this great thing it was a couple weeks ago. The online form to get student aid was a total colossal failure and a mess. And we helped them and they redid the website. And then the GAO critiqued them because they had some process fails in their redoing of the website. But of course the website now worked, right? And it was, so there's like, how do you actually get rid of that kind of frame of thinking? This is where Doge failed, is like, our digital platform in government is horrible. I mean, it's just really, it's, try and get your benefits if you're on unemployment or anything else, and every benefit has a different platform and nothing carries over. And we work on like, what are these really arcane rules that are inhibiting agencies from actually developing good websites and digital platforms. And then the fourth one that we work on a lot is, and there's a legal element to this and rulings on Chevron and all the rest, but there's this total gap now, or there's always this gap between like Congress legislating and the agencies executing. And then, so you can pass a bill and then the implementation has failed because there was no kind of feedback between the executive and the legislative branch. So we're trying to build those feedback. So those are just 4 ways, all of which I think are very consistent with my one time, still somewhat there, libertarian roots. But it's just a recognition that you just have to have a government that's actually able to deliver. And as each of those 4, we can actually go into specifics. We can kind of go and like, the Paperwork Reduction Act makes it so that when an agency wants to redesign their form for you to fill out, they have to go through this whole bureaucratic process to make sure they're not increasing paperwork, which means they're not going to do it, which means you're going to get a crappy online experience and not fill out the form and get your benefit or something. Like crazy stuff like that. That's just like in the weeds. And so in some sense, we're looking for like anthropologists, I don't know what it is, like to just uncover these things one by one. Those are all, that's like my technocratic answer. I still get back to the go versus stop energy. There is like, and this is my last point on abundance I said, sort of looking at sort of the younger generation. There needs to be a vibe shift. Like there needs to be like, things are bad and we can make it better. Like how do we make things better? Everything I just said about civil service reform and digital platforms, whatever, is the technocratic details of making things better. And some of them are like, overcoming resistance to like, which I think is a conservative impulse, like, no, you can't do that. Like there's a process here. So I think there's that overlay of like a cultural milieu that needs to happen. Much as I kind of oversimplify, but said post-World War II to early 70s, there was a shift, a bipartisan shift to constraining government. And now we need to kind of figure out to have a thing like, it's like, yeah, things are bad, we can make it better. And to me, that's a little bit of closing the gap between the elites and the working class. It's like these institutions need to work better.
Thank you all for being here today and everybody in the room for the discussion. Just to dovetail off a couple points that have already been made, just to circle back to, I think, Dr. Wolfer's original comment, this seems kind of like Econ 101 and at risk of distilling abundance down to just a simple like econ phrase, it sounds a lot like supply side liberalism. So how does the abundance framework account for trying to balance rapidly increasing supply of things and also of services, while at the same time ensuring that there's still economic productivity, and also balancing that upgrading a lot of our existing frameworks, as you just said, a lot of them may not be able to tolerate such rapid progress in their current state. Like perhaps I'm being a little bit too narrow-minded here, but just how does this framework hold all of that in balance?
So the first part, yeah, it's very, to me, it is very much supply side progressivism, I think was the term of art that I want to say Ezra once used. So yeah, abundance to me is very much supply and demand. How do we increase supply so that we can lower prices and get more of the things that we want? It's the confluence on the progressive side, there's a lot of progressive goals, whether it's housing or energy or whatnot, that are being constrained. And on the more conservative or libertarian side, a recognition that you need a well-functioning state in order to actually provide these things. So to me, that's where they kind of meet in the middle. I don't know if the middle, they meet on common ground and abundance. I didn't quite understand the other part of your question. I see only, well, let me rephrase it. Artificially constraining supply of things that people need just makes it more costly. I think it will unleash productivity if we actually can increase supply. And I think you see this in the numbers. Like, again, I'm kind of picking on something happening in the 70s. But once upon a time, there were kind of mass, call it exogenous events that meant all the jobs are no longer here, they're over there, let's move. And people moved. So there was a migration to Detroit, right? And so when there were kind of economic developments or technological change, people by and large went where they can deploy their skills and talents most productively, and that increased productivity. And once you make it harder for people to move, it hampers productivity. So there is an argument to be made that the productivity decrease that we've seen over the last few decades is because people are sticking to where they are. They don't move. It's too costly to move. They can't afford the rent in the Bay Area or in major cities. And you see it now too. Like, I was in Austin recently. Like, people are leaving Austin because supply is constrained and they can't afford the housing there, and so they leave. So I see almost everything associated with abundance on the supply side as productivity enhancing. And the only other thing I would add, which is the progress study parts, is like, this gets into sort of like a more, call it muscular government, I guess, which is, I think, and this is one of my critiques of what's happening in this administration, I think they're undermining two of the engines for success in this country. One is an public investment in R&D, in the sciences and research, and two is a welcoming of people to contribute to just their talents and hard work, whether or not it's in sciences or others, within the law. Totally understand that part. And so, to me, when I talked about what's missing for abundance that I add to it, immigration is part of it, science, R&D and investment in science and incentivizing deployment and development of technology was part of it as well. Also productivity enhancing. I think that gets left out of the abundance debate. I just kind of put it back in there because I think it's entirely consistent.
We have time for one more. Hi, my name is Michael. I'm a law student here. Before that, I got a degree in urban planning, and so I kind of arrived at abundance. People arrive at abundance through different avenues, and I arrived through the urbanism kind of spectrum. And so from that perspective, I feel like there's been tremendous unevenness in terms of success. I get the impression on housing, YIMBY is notching up a lot of successes every year, in California especially, but actually increasingly across the country. I feel like we're seeing success. Energy seems to be mid-range. Solar seems to be making a lot of progress. Interconnection seems to remain a huge issue. Transit and transportation seems to still be really stuck. If you listen to Eric Goldwyn and Alan Levy at NYU, it's things are getting worse, not better. So I'm curious, why within this abundance framework have we seen such a divergence of areas of success versus areas of continued, frankly, failure?
Yeah, it's a great question, and somewhere I didn't put it in my comments, but we talked about, is abundance anything new? And someone says abundance is the YIMBY movement, really, and especially when it comes to housing. And I totally agree with your assessment. This is maybe totally Pollyanna-ish. I just thought it was first mover advantage that these places really just, housing is extremely salient in a way that clean energy might not be, but is increasingly so. And so at Niskanen, we're working on transmission and we're working on transportation. But even if you looked at Niskanen, it's a great example of it. If you look at whatever our work, which is supply side abundance line, started with the housing team. We added the energy team. We recently hired a transportation person and a health person who's a health abundance person. So we're sort of following the trend that you laid out. I don't know. I'm hopeful that it'll see similar successes. I hadn't thought about maybe there's just something different there, and it could be something to do with underlying laws, like you have these, like, can the state preempt the local in order to kind of loosen some of these constraints? That's a very different animal than something like transmission, which is across state lines, right? You can't. It's not a localism in the same way. It's a state level. So you might have different kind of political economy constraints that would apply differentially. I haven't really thought about it, but I think it's worth the thinking, because we're investing in Niskanen and these other policy areas with the idea that they can follow some of the YIMBY successes.
Ted, it's always a great pleasure to see you, mate.
Great to
Thank
see you.
very
Thank
much.
you, everybody, for coming.
Well, please join me in thanking Professor Justin Wolfers for moderating a fantastic conversation, and Ted Gayer, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a wonderful conversation. We want to remind everybody we're having another abundance discussion this Friday, where we will have one of the authors, Ezra Klein, via video in the Annenberg at what time, Daniel, on Friday? 11:45. So if you'd like more information about that event, please see Daniel. And I want to thank you all for joining us, and thank you again to our outstanding guest, Ted Gayer. It's been a pleasure to have you here. Thank you, everyone. Take care.